And today we're discussing our Week 12 must-start plays at every single position. We're going to go through quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end. Get you ready for your Week 12 matchups. Just a side note, with us recording this on Thursday night, I went ahead and removed the players for Thursday Night Football. Felt like there was really no reason to have them in here. So if you're wondering where they're at, it's because I went ahead and just removed them because those games have already happened. So let's go ahead and get right to it and start with the quarterback position. And we're going to start with one of my favorite quarterbacks of the weekend, and that is going to be Brock Purdy. Now, Purdy missed 6 weeks before returning last week against the Cardinals. In his return, he completed 26 passes for 200 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 19 fantasy points in his 3 starts this season. He's averaging 19 fantasy points, which ranks top 10 among quarterbacks. It also helps that the 49ers are getting back all of their weapons, and Brandon Ayuk could be back at some point this season, though I'm probably not going to hold my breath at this point. Either way, this week against the Panthers on the surface, it does look like a tough matchup. The Panthers have allowed the 8th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. However, this is one of those situations where context matters. This season, the Panthers have faced Trevor Lawrence, Kyler Murray, Michael Penix, twice Tua, Justin Fields, and Tyler Shook, none of whom are scary passing offenses. They also faced Drake May and Josh Allen, but were blown out, and both resulting in neither offense really needing to throw the ball that much. But against good passing offense, we've seen Dak Prescott put up 261 yards and 3 touchdowns for 26 fantasy points, as well as Drake May in a blowout put up 201 passing yards and 2 touchdowns for another 27 fantasy points. Long story short, Brock Purdy's in a good spot this week and should be viewed as a top 8 quarterback. Keep moving here, and let's move over to Jacoby Brissett. Now, Brissett has been a garbage time merchant the last few weeks. Since taking over as quarterback, Brissett has averaged over 300 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, and 22 fantasy points per game. It has also helped that the Cardinals have been extremely pass-heavy with 41 pass attempts per game, which is the 8th highest rate in the league. Next up for Brissett and the Cardinals is another home matchup against the Jags pass defense that allows 250 passing yards, over 2 touchdowns, and 21.5 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. Overall, they allow the 5th most fantasy points to QBs, making Jacoby Brissett a top 12 quarterback play this week. Next up is going to be Jackson Dart. Dart is expected to return this week against the Lions after missing week 11 due to a concussion. Previously to that, Dart had been a reliable fantasy asset. Since taking over since week 4, he has been a QB1 in 5 of 7 starts and averaging 23 fantasy points per game. Now, a fair question is whether he will run at the same frequency as before the concussion. His rushing upside has been a significant contributor to his production this year. He trails only Josh Allen with 7 rushing touchdowns and has 50 or more rushing yards in 6 of his 7 starts. Dart has averaged 3.4 design runs per game, which was the 2nd highest rate for any quarterback this year. I would guess that number is lower moving forward, but I doubt it. He just completely stops running the ball when the opportunity presents itself. Next up for the rookie quarterback is a matchup against the Lions on the road. The Lions pass defense has struggled this season against quarterbacks, allowing nearly 2 passing touchdowns, 220 passing yards per game. They've also allowed the 8th most rushing touchdowns to quarterbacks as well. Jackson Dart is a low-end QB1 this week against the Lions. Let's keep moving here. Let's move over to Caleb Williams. Caleb Williams has been up and down this year, but there have been more ups than downs. Williams is currently the QB9, averaging 19.7 fantasy points per game, and is the QB12 in fantasy points per dropback. Now, he's not been very efficient, ranking 18th in EPA per dropback, and is completing just 59% of his passes. That's only better than Cam Ward, Dylan Gabriel, and J.J. McCarthy. One area that has helped Caleb is his rushing upside. He currently has the 7th most rushing yards and 3 rushing touchdowns, which is also 8th most. This week, the Bears get a home matchup against the Steelers. Pittsburgh has been a favorable matchup for quarterbacks. They're allowing 280 passing yards, 1.6 passing touchdowns, and 21.2 fantasy points per game, which ranks 7th most. The Bears are 2.5-point favorites and have the 11th highest implied team total this week. I have Caleb Williams a top 15 quarterback play. Now let's move over to our running backs. We're going to start with TreVeyon Henderson versus the Bengals. Over the last 2 weeks, Henderson has finally broken out. He racked up 243 total yards and 5 total touchdowns while averaging 30 PPR points per game against the Bucs and Jets. Now, the biggest question is what this role will look when and if Ramondre Stevenson can return this week. Sort of like Chuba Hubbard, I don't see how the Pats can go back to the way things were before the injury, where Ramondre was playing 60% of the snaps, handling 50% of the total rush attempts from his backfield. On the season, Ramondre has averaged a gross 3.4 yards per carry, and he ranks 40th in missed tackles forced, 36th in breakaway run rate, and 45th in yards created per touch. Now, on the other side, TreVeyon Henderson has been significantly better, averaging 4.9 yards per carry, and he's also better efficiency-wise, ranking 28th in missed tackles forced, 16th in your breakaway run rate, and 29th in yards created per touch. My best guess is Ramondre still handles the short yardage work as well as goal line carries. Well, TreVeyon gets the passing game work, and I think the run game is split 60-40 on the TreVeyon Henderson side. Either way, this week the Patriots get the lowly Bengals. The Bengals are allowing 137 rushing yards, nearly a touchdown per game. In the passing game, they're also allowing 48.5 receiving yards per game, and over a half a touchdown per game. Running backs, overall, they've allowed the most fantasy points to running backs. Henderson is an RB1. And if Ramondre returns, I still think he's a very viable flex play. Let's keep moving. Over to Kenneth Walker. Kenneth Walker had his best fantasy game of the season this past week. It's one of the best run defenses in the Rams. He ended up playing 51% of the snaps with 19 total touches and 111 yards and a score for 20.1 PPR points. On Monday, head coach Mike McDonald spoke and said that he thought Kenneth Walker had earned more touches moving forward. There's absolutely no denying how bad Kenneth Walker has been this season. He's averaging just 11.1 PPR points per game. He's averaging 13.6 carries and has been a non-factor in the passing game with just a 6% target share. Furthermore, Zach Charbonnet has received 9 carries compared to just 6 for Kenneth Walker inside the 5-yard line. Next up for Kenneth Walker and the Seahawks, a road matchup against the Titans where they are 13.5-point favorites. As a matchup, the Titans are allowing 4.7 yards per carry, 134.7 rushing yards, and over 1.5 touchdowns per game to running backs. This is a very good spot for Kenneth Walker to build off last week. Walker is a high-end RB2 for me. Let's keep moving. Let's move over to the Jaguars backfield. First, I want to hit on is Travis Etienne. There's been a ton of hype surrounding Bashaw Tutin in recent weeks. It's gotten to the point where Etienne has been made a footnote in this backfield. Etienne has been a very good fantasy running back through 11 weeks of the season. He's averaging 15.4 carries, 3.3 targets. He's turned that into 859 total yards and 6 touchdowns, good for 14.3 fantasy points per game, or the RB15. He's also been good on a per-touch basis, ranking 10th in missed tackles forced, 14th in explosive run rate, and 16th in yards after contact per attempt. Now, as far as Bashaw Tutin is concerned, we saw Tutin put together his best game of the season last week after he suffered. We saw Tutin put together his best game of the year last week until he suffered an ankle injury. Before exiting, he actually carried the ball 15 times, just 11 for Travis Etienne. He finished with 15 carries for 74 yards and a score for 13.4 PPR points. It does look like Tutin will be available to play this week after getting in a limited session on Wednesday, and then he was a full participant on Thursday. Something we do need to monitor, though, is Travis Etienne, who was added to the practice report with a shoulder injury and was limited today as he practiced with a non-contact jersey. I do think Etienne probably plays this weekend, but he could be limited, opening the door for Tutin to see a little bit more opportunities this weekend. Simply put, I love Bashaw Tutin, but this is not a Rachaad White and Bucky Irving situation from last year. I think for the most part, moving forward, I think Etienne is going to be a viable RB2 rest of season, with Tutin continuing to receive probably 12 to 13 touches per game, making him a very viable flex play. Now, this week, this matchup against the Cardinals, they were allowing the 15th most rushing yards, but the 4th most touchdowns to running backs this year. Overall, they've allowed the 10th most PPR points to running backs. Etienne is a strong RB2 play as long as he goes, with Tutin being more of a flex play. If Etienne were to miss, though, I do think Tutin would be a low-end RB1 or a high-end RB2 against the Cardinals. Keep moving here, and let's talk about Alvin Kamara. This is the first time all season I have featured Alvin Kamara in this video. It's been a rough season for the 30-year-old running back. Despite handling 70% of the total opportunities in this backfield, he is still averaging 9.7 fantasy points per game, which would make him the RB30. He's receiving 12.8 carries and 3.7 targets per game. Two main factors that have held him back this year is despite being 8th in targets, it's a far cry from the 20% target share or the 6.4 targets per game he received last year. He's still the clear passing down back with a 56% route participation. But Kellen Moore's offenses have never been friendly to running backs in the passing game. The second issue is he's only scored 1 touchdown all year with only 2 goal line carries. Those two things combined are making him hard to trust every single week. This week, though, I do think this is a week we can lean into Alvin Kamara as he gets a great matchup against the Falcons, who have allowed the 4th most PPR points to running back. So let's keep moving. Let's move over to some flex options here. First, I want to hit on is David Montgomery. Montgomery has played more of a secondary role this year to Jahmyr Gibbs. He's currently handling 40% of the snaps. He's averaging about 11 carries, 1.9 targets per game. He's turned that into 11 fantasy points per game. And next up is a home matchup against the Giants, who have struggled to stop opposing running backs. They currently allow 116 rushing yards and the 5th most touchdowns and the 3rd most PPR points overall to running backs. It's a very good spot to fire up David Montgomery in the flex. And I also have Jahmyr Gibbs as my number 1 running back overall on the week. Let's keep moving here. Let's move over to Bam Knight. Trey Benson returned to practice this week after his 21-day practice window open. It remains to be seen if he will actually suit up this week or not. If he doesn't, Bam Knight has a decent opportunity ahead of him with Amari DiMercato already being ruled out of this game. It would leave just Michael Carter behind him. I do have him as a flex because this isn't the best matchup as the Jaguars. I have allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points to running backs, and this is solely a volume play for me. Let's keep moving here. Let's move over to Kenneth Gainwell. I wanted to mention Gainwell because I do have him as an RB3, mainly because we don't know if Jaylen Warren will play. If Warren were to miss, I would move him inside my top 20 against Bears defense that allows the 16th most PPR points. Warren sat out Wednesday's practice, but he did return to practice on Thursday, which is a positive sign. But if Warren does play, I think Gainwell is still in play in PPR formats as he does see a very healthy amount of targets in the passing game every single week. Lastly, I just want to talk about this Chiefs backfield. Isaiah Pacheco returned to practice this week, paving the way for him to return against the Colts. I prefer Kareem Hunt among the group, but Pacheco likely still sees 10 plus touches, making him somewhat of a viable flex play. But there's certainly a lot of volatility with that profile. All right, let's keep moving. Now let's move over to wide receivers, and we're going to first hit on T. Higgins. Jamar Chase was suspended after spitting in Jalen Ramsey's face this past weekend. On the more positive side of things, Joe Burrow got a full practice in on Wednesday, which that trend continued on Thursday with him getting another full practice and getting all the reps with the number one offense. It really is looking like Joe Burrow is going to return. As far as Higgins is concerned, he had a really slow start to the season. However, since week 5, he's averaging 7.2 targets, 68 receiving yards, and nearly a touchdown and 17 PPR points per game. Now with Chase off the field, Higgins likely sees 10 to 12 targets in this game and should be the focal point in the red zone and should exploit a Patriots secondary that has allowed the third most touchdowns to wide receivers this year. Higgins is an easy top 10 wide receiver play from this week. Now moving over to the other side of that game, let's talk about Stephon Diggs. It's been really impressive to see how well Stephon Diggs has played this season, despite being nearly 32-year-old, coming off a torn ACL in week 8 of last season. On the season, Diggs is currently being targeted on 27% of routes run and is averaging 13 PPR points per game. Even more impressive is his efficiency numbers as he ranks 8th in yards per route run and 18th in yards between pass attempts. He's the focal point of the offense once they get inside the red zone as well. But his 27% red zone target share ranks top 11 among wide receivers. However, if you peel back the layers a bit, since week 4, when he started to run more routes, command more targets, he's actually been the wide receiver 7 overall, averaging over 15 PPR points per game. Diggs should be able to build on a strong season with a matchup against the Bengals. While the Bengals defense has been horrible this year, DJ Turner has been a lone bright spot this season. He's only allowed 51% completion percentage and just a 79.5 passer rating when targeted. Good news for Diggs, though, is he will avoid Turner since Diggs runs 68% of his routes from the slot, and Turner rarely ever travels into the slot. Who Diggs will see, though, is Daxton Hill, who has allowed a rough over 70% completion percentage and a 95.5 passer rating. Diggs is a top 10 wide receiver for me this week. Let's keep moving here. Let's move over to Chris Olave. Olave has been a target hog this season, receiving a strong 27.5% target per out run rate and a 33.8 first read target share. Both of those marks rank inside the top 12. He's also been utilized as a deep threat with 17 deep targets, as well as inside the red zone with 10 targets. The Saints have been a heavy pass offense this year, averaging nearly 37 pass attempts per game, which has allowed Olave to be a borderline wide receiver 1, averaging 14.9 PPR points per game. Next up for the Saints is a great matchup against a very beat-up Falcons team. The Falcons have allowed the 7th most touchdowns and the 14th most PPR points to wide receivers. Fire up Olave with confidence again this week. Let's keep moving. Let's move over to Ted McMillan. Now, Ted McMillan is coming off easily his best game of the year, securing 8 of 12 targets for 130 yards and 2 scores for 33 PPR points. The biggest issue for McMillan this season isn't usage. He ranks 7th in targets and a 33% first read target share. The issue has been Bryce Young, who's only eclipsed 200 passing yards twice all year. Now, last week was one of those weeks where he had over 400 passing yards with 3 scores against the Falcons, and we see how good McMillan could be when the passing attack is absolutely rolling. McMillan on the season is wide receiver 16 in fantasy points per game, averaging 13.9, and ranks 23rd in yards per out run and 14th in yards between pass attempts. The opportunity is certainly there for Bryce Young and McMillan to keep things rolling against a really bad 49ers defense. The 49ers have allowed the 3rd most receiving yards, the 8th most touchdowns, and the 5th most PPR points to wide receivers. McMillan is a low-end wide receiver 1 or high-end wide receiver 2. Let's keep moving. Let's move over to Michael Wilson. Now, Michael Wilson had a career game last week against the 49ers. He was targeted an absurd 18 times. He turned that into 15 catches for 185 yards. Last week was the first game in which in his career that he exceeded 15 fantasy points. So this does feel a little bit chasey here, but Jacoby Brissett has supported multiple pass catchers all year. Next up for Michael Wilson is a matchup against a really bad Jags pass defense. The Jags have allowed the 8th most receiving touchdowns and the 12th most PPR points overall. I would be lying if I didn't think there was absolutely some volatility here, but I think there is certainly wide receiver 3 upside with him. But I do want to say that we've seen this type of stuff before where wide receivers come out and have huge breakout performances. We don't hear from them again. I mean, think Travis Fulgham 2 years ago, whenever that dude just went off and then, didn't really do anything the rest of the year. I'm not necessarily saying that's going to be Michael Wilson, but there's certainly some volatility here. I've seen people have him as like a top 12, top 15 wide receiver play this week, and that's absolutely ridiculous to me. I think that is absolutely point chasing, and I do think that's going to get people in trouble this week. I think he's a viable wide receiver 3 play, especially with 4 teams on bye and with other players that are out. But not embracing the volatility here, I think, could end up being a mistake for people. But I will say, another wide receiver in that game that I do like is also Greg Dortch. Speaking of Cardinals wide receivers, lost in the Michael Wilson hype was Greg Dortch's performance last week. He held in all 6 of his targets for 66 yards and a touchdown for 18.6 PPR points. Dortch has actually been the more consistent wide receiver among the group between Dortch and Wilson. Dortch in his career, when running 60% or more of the routes, is actually averaging 13 PPR points per game. With Marv out, Dortch is still a very good play. Let's keep moving over to Andre Ishivas versus the Patriots. Plenty of things to unpack here. Ja'Marr Chase is out this week, as we've already talked about, starting the 1-game suspension. Then we also have the Joe Burrow practicing, and it looks like he might end up playing. With everything considered, Andre Ishivas certainly has some appeal here. The Patriots currently are allowed the 14th most PPR points to wide receiver. Ishivas actually gets the best matchup as he primarily plays in the slot. Marcus Jones allows 0.31 fantasy points per route run, which is the 10th worst among all corners. Jones allows a 96.9 quarterback rating and a whopping 5 touchdowns already this year to wide receivers. Ishivas makes for a very solid flex play. Lastly, I want to hit on is Luther Burden. Burden finally received more opportunities last week than Olamide Zaccheaus. He ended up playing roughly 45% of the snaps, but ran a route on 67% of dropbacks. He ended up being targeted 5 times. Ben Johnson also had positive things to say about the rookie wide receiver, and he's felt he's earned more playing time this year. This is a phenomenal matchup for Burden, as the Steelers allowed the most fantasy points to opposing wideouts. There's definitely some risk here, but Burden is certainly a strong wide receiver 4 play for me in week 12. I think some other players you could consider as well as pretty good flex plays this week are Tez Johnson, Xavier Legette, Josh Downs, Kayshon Boutte if he returns, and Darnell Mooney. Let's keep moving here. Let's move over to the tight end position. First, I want to hit on is Hunter Henry. We're just following the flow chart here. The Bengals are horrible against opposing tight ends. I think I have harped on this enough. But if you are new here, we play tight ends against the Bengals in this house. Henry is hovering around 4 to 6 targets per game, but he really hasn't had a useful week since week 4 when he scored 11.9 PPR points. Henry checks all the boxes we look for, though, in a tight end that we should look to stream. He ranks 2nd in deep targets, 7th in red zone targets. He's also running 81% of the routes, which ranks 11th. I think Henry has tight end 1 upside this week and could be a top 5 tight end play with this matchup against the Bengals, who have been shredded by tight ends all year. Next up, let's move over to Cade Otton. Otton had a bit of a down week last time out against the Bills. He secured just 2 of 5 targets for 28 yards. Now, there was 20-mile-an-hour wind which impacted the passing game. Prior to week 11, Otton scored 10 or more fantasy points in 4 of the previous 5 games. I think he gets back on track this week against a Rams defense that has struggled against tight ends, allowing the 10th most PPR points to the position. Keep moving. Let's move over to Colston Loveland. Even with Cole Kmet back last week, Colston Loveland still played 71% of the snaps and ran 60% of the routes. He ended up being targeted 4 times. He turned that into 3 receptions for 40 yards. As long as he continues to receive this type of playing time, positive regression is bound to come his way. And I think it comes this week with a juicy matchup against the Steelers defense that has allowed the 6th most PPR points to tight ends. I have Loveland as a top 12 tight end play this week. Lastly, Noah Fant. We're just going to keep going back to that. Well, not a huge ceiling here in this matchup, but he scored 14.4, 7.1, 10.8, and 6.6 fantasy points the last 4 weeks. With Chase out, he could see a bump in opportunity here for Noah Fant this week. Now, as the Patriots ranked allowed the most receptions, the 5th most receiving yards, and the 9th most touchdowns, as well as the 7th most fantasy points to tight ends this week. So I do think Noah Fant is also in play. Lastly, I think some other options you can look at is Chig Okonkwo. Seahawks allowed the 3rd most PPR points to tight ends. I also think this is going to be a very heavy passing game script against a really tough matchup against the Seahawks, but where they have struggled is against tight ends. I think some other options you could look at is Mason Taylor versus the Ravens, with Tyrod Taylor taking over at quarterback, and then AJ Barner on the other side of that game against the Titans. So that being said, let me know in the comment section below if you have any questions. Get these W's this week before Thanksgiving. We'll see you on the next one. Bye.